Glenn and Paul, thank you for taking time to talk through another hotspot in the world, this time Africa. First time for us, Glenn, of course. And for those who are listening, obviously, you know me, Ryan, spent time in the Army and the CIA, but I have to say we've got two folks on the call. I wouldn't even say that I was in the same agency as them, given their backgrounds, but you're well acquainted with Glenn. We've talked Middle East, we've talked Syria, expert on Russia, has been a multi-time COS over 3 decades in the agency, State Department, and of course the military, storied career. And Glenn, would love to just pass it over to you as we tee up who our new guest is.
Hey, Ryan, it's great to see you, and thanks for having us on. As you mentioned, this is another hotspot which has emerged, not surprising. I think when we kind of talked about the plan for some of these podcasts, it was to make sure that we paid attention to areas of the world that were important geopolitically for the U.S., but maybe don't always get the attention they should. And this is definitely an example of what's happening in the DRC right now. So I'm glad that you came to me to ask me about this, because geopolitically, with what's going on with Russia and China and the competition for minerals, supply chain issues for the United States, I can't stress how important this is. And when you asked me to do the podcast, I said, I'd love to, but I don't really know that much about Africa. But I know someone that does. I know someone that knows Africa inside and out, a true expert, and that is Mr. Paul Kepp, Professor Paul Kepp, who, by the way, just started teaching here at the Institute of World Politics with us. So we're love to have him here. We're very happy about that. And before we go any further, I do want to thank the team here at IWP for allowing us to use the campus for this great podcast. So Paul, I'll let Paul talk a little bit about his background and delve into the issue, but we couldn't have anybody better to talk about the issue right now in Africa.
Thanks, Glenn. Thanks, Ryan. Yes, my name's Paul Kepp, and like Glenn, I served about 3 decades in the CIA on the Directorate of Operations side. Most of that was spent in Africa. I did tours all over the world, in South Asia and Europe, other places, but most of the time was in Africa, and I still consider it my hometown.
Fantastic. And then just as we tee this up, I mean, we're going to get into what's going on now in the DRC, of course, but just contextually, if we can frame this from a Russia and Africa expert here, what is the influence and aspects of Africa today that we see with Russia and China? You mentioned the resource topic, Glenn, but what should other people be thinking as they think about Africa when it comes to Russia, China, and some of the global powers?
Well, in terms of the Russians, we've seen them moving with their private military companies, trying to influence both creating political instability in different countries, looking to exploit that instability to advance their economic interests, maybe in mining, trading security for access to mineral resources, providing some weapons. And when it comes to China, we know that China is probably a much bigger competitor for the U.S. and our European partners in Africa right now. The Chinese have invested heavily in infrastructure projects, mining, ports, agriculture, and I would suggest that China, the PRC, is a bigger competitor and much more important competitor for the United States to compete with today. And with the new administration in office, hopefully they will put the level of attention back on Africa that we maybe had during the Cold War, when we were competing with the Soviet Union and, to a lesser degree, China at that time.
Yeah, I would just add to that. Both Russia and China are players in Africa. Russia, its involvement in Africa, in every sense of the word, really is mercenary. It's rather limited right now to a handful of countries in the Sahel and the Central African Republic. It's very focused on providing security to these autocratic regimes there. And I would say Russia's political influence in Africa is actually limited, and certainly limited compared to China. China's a completely different story. Their focus on the African continent has been going on since about 2000, and they have significant political and economic influence and interests throughout Africa. In the context of the crisis we're talking about here in the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda, it was Mao Zedong himself who said once during the Cold War, "He who controls the Congo controls Africa." And there's some truth to that statement. It's an enormous country. It's the size of the United States east of the Mississippi. It's got a large population, and very relevant to today's world, it has tremendous natural resources. That essentially is at the core of the current conflict. And China certainly will have an interest, as the United States and other countries will, in what happens in the current crisis.
You know, Ryan, if I could just add very quickly, beyond Russia and China, there are other players now in Africa that are very active. The Turks, for example, have opened up numerous embassies, a lot of investment, a lot of projects. I think the Emiratis, some other countries who are investing a lot. So the continent is very active. And I would say, in my own assessment, we've probably ignored Africa or not put enough attention to Africa in recent years, and we need to do a lot more to protect our interests.
Paul, could we kick it to you to give us an idea of what's going on right now? Why is this the topic for Africa today? And then also just some historical context as you describe the size of this country and where it sits, just to help frame what we're about to dig into.
Sure. Just for your listeners to summarize where we are right now, a rebel group called M23 has taken over a major city in eastern Congo called Goma. M23 is widely believed, and I think correctly so, to be a proxy of the Congo's neighbor, Rwanda. And they're taking over this important city in eastern Congo is an important event. Goma is the gateway to eastern Congo, where so many of these mineral resources are located. It's been the location or the site of a pretty much continuous humanitarian crisis. But it's important to understand that what's happened in the past couple of weeks in the eastern Congo is a continuation of a conflict that has gone on basically since 1994. It really began with the genocide in Rwanda in the spring and summer of 1994. I don't think it's any exaggeration to say that in the African context, that genocide had the impact of something like the creation of the State of Israel in 1947 did in the Middle East, or partition in South Asia did right after World War II. It was a major shockwave, not just in the humanitarian sense, but in the political sense as well. It led to the downfall of what was then Zaire's dictator, Mobutu Sese Seko. It cemented Rwanda's place as a major influence in the entire Great Lakes region. And the war at various times in eastern Congo drew in no less than 15 African countries who were pursuing their individual interests politically and economically in the Congo. That war, that conflict has continued to this day that started in 1994. Ceasefires have come and gone, peace agreements have come and gone, but the conflict and the humanitarian crisis it's engendered has never really ended. So I think that's a little bit of historical background for your listeners. The array of rebel groups, proxy forces, and so forth that have paraded through the Congo, we could spend all day listing those. But I think we can sum it up in one key phrase. All of it is tied to Rwanda's drive for dominance and hegemony in eastern Congo. And what we've seen in the last few days with this rebel group M23 taking over Goma is a continuation of that event. M23 took the city once before in 2012. They gave it up under intense international pressure and moved back into the bush. But I think one question that's worth thinking about today is now they've got the city again, or are on the cusp of taking it. What's changed between 2012 and today?
Why now, of all the times to move in? Was there something that led to this decision at this point in time that we can point to? That's
a great question. It's still shaking out, but I think we can put some ideas on the table to answer that question that would make a lot of sense. One of them gets exactly to what Glenn said here. And that is, over the past 5 or 10 years, we've seen a range of new players in Africa. Rwanda, which has a very well-organized, a disciplined, and well-led military, is absolutely not blind to these new opportunities. Glenn mentioned correctly so, I think, 2 countries, Turkey and the United Arab Emirates. Rwanda has carefully cultivated relationships with these 2 nations. In fact, just a few days ago, Paul Kagame, the president of Rwanda, made a high-profile state visit to Turkey. It may be no accident that his decision through his proxy force, M23, to take over this important city was linked to this visit. In fact, Erdogan and Kagame, I think, share some distinct traits as leaders. You could almost really call it a Rwanda first policy, to use lingo that's popular, today. And I think he sees that this diversification of his key relationships are very important. Something else that's changed since 2012 is Rwanda's relationship with Europe. 2 of Paul Kagame's fiercest critics in Europe have been the United Kingdom and France. Rwanda has handled its relationship with Europe, and particularly with these 2 countries, in a very interesting way, in a very careful and strategic way. We're all aware of the UK government's plan to deport illegal immigrants from the UK to Rwanda. That policy collapsed under political pressure in the UK. But that Rwanda was willing to do this and engage in this kind of sensitive geopolitical negotiation with London is a suggestion that they're taking the long game. Similarly, let's look at northern Mozambique, a country that seemingly has no connection to Rwanda. But there is an Islamic State-inspired insurgency which erupted in northern Mozambique in 2017. This coincided with the discovery of major natural gas reserves just off the coast of Mozambique. One of the key investors in those gas fields is the French company Total. So in 2021, Paul Kagame took his army, the Rwanda Patriotic Force, the RPF, and deployed units of the RPF to northern Mozambique to help improve security there. And indeed, that deployment has been largely successful. This disciplined, effective organization has had an impact in northern Mozambique. France has been one of the beneficiaries of that. I'm not suggesting for a minute that countries are going to necessarily moderate their criticism of what Rwanda is doing in the Eastern Congo, but I think Paul Kagame and his government's positioning of itself with regard to its traditional partners and some new partners is something that can't be ignored in this current crisis.
I think one thing people will find surprising is the interest of other countries in Europe and around the world in this part of Africa. And we've mentioned minerals. Can you expand on that just a little bit? Like, what is it that is resident within the DRC that is so attractive that would pull this type of grouping in?
Well, it's there are some actually relatively rare minerals that are can be found in Eastern Congo. One, it's called coltan. The engineering of it is a little bit beyond me, but apparently this is a key mineral for mobile telephones and other electronic equipment. And Eastern Congo is one of the major sources of that. There are also huge gold reserves in Eastern Congo. I'll give you an example. Another country neighboring Congo, Uganda, which has been involved on and off in the conflict there. 20 years ago, Uganda exported almost no gold. In the past 20 years, Uganda has emerged as a major gold exporter. None of that gold comes from Uganda. It all comes from the Eastern Congo. So those mineral resources and riches are real, and they're there. There's been recent discovery of oil deposits, too, in that area. Congo has been blessed or cursed, depending on how you want to look at it, with just amazing geological riches. This is a big part of the reason that you see Rwanda involved there. It's the big part of the reason you saw these 15 other African countries at various times over the past 20, 25 years get involved there. So it's there. The other factor, too, that has allowed these countries to have such influence there is the Congolese state itself, and its capital, Kinshasa, is incredibly weak. Its ability to project power from the capital, Kinshasa, to Goma and the environs, which is the area we're talking about now, it's very limited. I mean, it's 1,000 miles of jungle, roadless, trackless wilderness between Kinshasa and this part of Eastern Congo that we're talking about. Rwanda, by contrast, the city of Goma sits right on the Rwandan border. So that geographic reality, coupled with a disciplined and effective military and security force in Kigali, has allowed Rwanda to act sometimes overtly, sometimes clandestinely, but always efficiently and effectively in the Eastern Congo.
Maybe a question for either of you, but just with the new administration in the US, I think we often say that we don't pay enough attention to Africa. And I was actually quite surprised just before we hit record that you had mentioned, Paul, that there was already some work going on within the administration on this issue in particular. How should we be thinking about or expecting to see this new administration moving on DRC?
You know, Ryan, when you say like, why now? One of the things, I'm a conspiratorial kind of minded guy. Maybe it's because where I spend a lot of my time in my career, but you just have a change of administration and someone might say, did they decide to make this move now because there may be some transition in Washington, some confusion? And I'll let Paul answer the question because he had that great news, which I thought was a very good sign about how this new administration is responding already.
Well, I think it's a question we should absolutely ask ourselves. And it goes back to a reality that's very important to remember. African leaders are acutely sensitive to global developments. They're sensitive to the opportunities and the risks that happen with changes in administration in Washington, in Europe, wherever. Geopolitical evolution. I'll give you one quick example from history on this that I think is very illustrates this very well. Eritrea, now a police state, small police state in the Horn of Africa, whose leader, Isaias Afwerki, has often been compared in some ways to Kagame as this so-called new generation of African leaders. In September of 2001, Isaias took action against all of his political opponents. He arrested dozens of his key ministers and leaders, people who had served with him for decades, people who were instrumental in the revolution and the insurgency which led to Eritrea's independence. That all took place on one day, September 18th, 2001. I'm sure there were many reasons Isaias chose that date, but I don't think I need to remind your listeners that the world's attention was elsewhere on September 18th, 2001. So let's bring it up to the present day. We have a new administration in Washington. We have this new activity by M23, Rwanda's proxy force in Eastern Congo. Are the two events connected? I think they very well could be. And I think that when you see some of the policies and the statements coming out of the Trump administration in Washington, perhaps a more muscular foreign policy in some ways, an America First policy, could we be seeing Rwanda, which has long had political and economic interests in Eastern Congo, in fact, has long sought, as I said, hegemony in this region? Could they have seen this as an opportunity for themselves to take on a Rwanda First policy? I don't have any hard evidence of that fact, but I think taken into the context of history and what Paul Kagame and his government have done in other times and other places, the possibility can't be discounted. I do think it's very interesting and very encouraging, quite frankly, that the new Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, has taken time out of his schedule. He's a busy man, I'm sure, right now, to talk to both leaders. What will come of that? It's impossible to say at this point. The situation is fluid and it's unfolding. But I think African leaders, both in Central Africa and throughout the continent, are going to be watching very closely how Washington responds as a signal for what kind of interest Washington is going to take in the continent. And I think the early signs are positive.
What is the potential for escalation here? What do you see playing out over the next few weeks with M23 and where they are? Do they advance further? Does this escalate into more conflict? What's your best guess there?
One likely scenario is that M23 will consolidate its position. Goma, the city that they just took over, really is the key. It's the gateway. It has a major airport there. It's a major humanitarian hub. It's the gateway to these resources that we talked about. And I should mention just in passing too, it's not just economics for Rwanda. There is a large Tutsi minority living in Eastern Congo known as the Banyamulenge. They've been there for decades. So the protection and support of this minority is also a political goal of Kigali. I think the key question now will be what kind of tolerance the international community, including the United States, has for allowing M23 to continue to hold this key city. As I mentioned, they did it once before in 2012. There was huge criticism of that rebel group and of Rwanda for allowing that to happen, and they eventually left. Has enough changed, as we discussed, between 2012 and now to allow a more permanent presence in that important city for M23 and for Rwanda? It remains to be seen, but it wouldn't entirely surprise me if we have a different outcome this time than we did 12 years ago.
Tough question here, but if you were in this administration or helping shape policy on Africa today, what do you think is happening in those discussions, and what would you recommend?
That really is a tough question. The international community has never been entirely able to satisfactorily answer Rwanda's demands. Some people say they're reasonable. Some people say they're unreasonable. But let's not forget, this all ties back to what happened in 1994. And if you lump that, at least in the regional context, as something, as important as, say, partition in South Asia, the creation of the State of Israel, we see how those decisions resonate and have presented almost insoluble problems even to this day. So I think the new administration and its Africa team has a real challenge on its hands in its early days here.
Wow.
So we'll see what happens. The school solution, if you will, would be to, as we did in 2012, put pressure on Rwanda to pull out its forces, to abide by the Luanda Accords, which was a peace accord that was in a process designed to address this instability there. But we'll see what happens.
Ryan, like we talk about China and Russia, but you probably know, like Biden went to Angola just before he left office, and the White House put a big emphasis on China, Russia competition, and the Angolans didn't like it at all because there was a lot of feedback that, like, how about us? Like, and you just look at some of the statistics, 7.2 million internally displaced persons in the DRC right now. I think 6 million people killed in 96 during the first Congo War. So there's the misery is incredible. And I was talking to Paul, I obviously do a lot of talks about Ukraine and the misery there caused by the Russians. But this crisis, this situation, it's been an ongoing crisis for years, is really something that Americans should be aware of and pay attention to. And of course, at the end of the day, we have our strategic interests, but, as a human being, it's just terrible to see kind of some of the suffering. And it's not just, Rwanda and, the DRC. There are hundreds of groups fighting. There are all kinds of armed groups, atrocities being committed. So I don't want to go down that rabbit hole too much on the podcast, but we should probably say something about the people of the DRC and all the people that are suffering.
And Ryan, to be honest, I agree completely with Glenn, and I'm glad he brought it up.
Yeah.
As we parse out the geopolitics and the history of it, there is a humanitarian cost to all this, and it has been ongoing for 30 years now. For all the difficulty of resolving the conflict once and for all, the international community, including the United States, deserves a lot of credit for actually making it a little bit better. There aren't 15 countries involved in the conflict anymore. There's just really 2 or 3. Now that's still important, but it's progress. So I think absolutely the humanitarian dimension of this needs to be at the forefront of whatever decisions are made.
And I guess you have this crisis now, explode or expanding again at the same time that you have, Syria. We've talked about Lebanon, Gaza, Russia, Ukraine. I mean, we go to this long list. And one thing I would say is, we mentioned other countries now that are involved, the Turks, UAE. The good news maybe is that some of those countries are our NATO allies. Some of those countries we have some common interests with. And my own recommendation would be that Washington look to partner with those countries to find the best solution. We don't have to bear the burden all by ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
We do have European partners, but I think the new player here really, in my mind, is Turkey, because they do have some economic throw weight. They have invested a lot in Africa, in building relationships. And where we have common interests, I think we should work with them. Where we don't, then we should make it clear to them that we don't agree with them. And if we have to push back on some of the things they want to do. And then to a lesser extent, the UAE. My understanding is the UAE is just investing a lot, right? But the Turks are there on the ground, and there are a lot of business activities going on, which are not always a bad thing.
Yeah, I would, I would agree with Glenn. I'd say it's far from a bad thing. I think some of these new players in Africa, the Gulf states, Turkey, will actually be much easier to work with than China and certainly Russia. And I think that presents new opportunities, including in this long-running conflict in the Eastern Congo.
Gents, thanks so much for the time. This was great. I don't know what we're doing next, Glenn, but looking forward to it. And Paul, I hope we can have you back on as well as you embark on this teaching journey. And I'm very jealous for the students in both of your classes there at IWP.
Thanks. It was a real pleasure to be on with you. Thanks.
Yeah, it's great seeing you, Ryan. And I'm sure we'll have something to talk about very soon.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, but fortunately.
Yeah.